Imagine a man. He's not exactly brilliant at school. His father has pretty much given up on him. As a young man, he heads off to war zones, works as a journalist, gets captured, escapes from prison, and somehow turns himself into the adventurer the whole country is talking about. Then he goes into politics, switches parties, helps plan a military campaign, and that campaign becomes a horrifying disaster at Gallipoli. Everyone assumes his career is finished. It isn't. Years later, that same man takes charge of Britain as Adolf Hitler closes in. With the country standing right on the edge of defeat, he sits down in front of a microphone and, through a handful of speeches, convinces millions of people to say, "No, we're not done yet." Then he wins the war, and the public votes him out at the very first election. Oh, and this story also has cigars, a lot of alcohol, a Nobel Prize in literature, a bricklaying hobby, and a genuine possibility that meetings were occasionally held while he was still in his pajamas. But behind all that sits a much more uncomfortable side of the story: his devotion to empire, his racist remarks, his attitude toward India, the Bengal famine, bombing decisions, and enormous mistakes that affected the lives of thousands. So Winston Churchill's life is not a simple great hero story, but declaring him nothing more than a villain and moving on is too easy as well. Churchill could be unbelievably brave and unbelievably stubborn at exactly the same time. Sometimes that stubbornness changed the world. Sometimes it wrecked everything. So how did a man who barely scraped through his exams and personally drove his political career off a cliff several times become Britain's last hope in 1940? That is where the real story begins. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. And when we say palace, that isn't an exaggeration. This was the sort of place with enormous halls, paintings, gardens, the kind of house where you could get lost and emerge 3 days later through an entirely different wing. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, belonged to the old and powerful Marlborough family. Among Winston's ancestors was the famous soldier and statesman John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Winston would later idolize him and write entire volumes about his life. So yes, the family legacy was already sitting on Winston's shoulders when he was a child. Just a little pressure, only a few centuries worth. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was American. She was the daughter of a wealthy New York financier and one of several rich American women who married into the British aristocracy during that period. The English family kept its title and social standing, while the American side gained a connection to ancient nobility. Basically a 19th century corporate merger, except with a wedding ring. Randolph and Jenny did not have a happy marriage. Both were caught up in their social lives and their own problems. Winston and his younger brother Jack were raised mostly by their nanny, Elizabeth Everest. Years later, Churchill would remember his mother as a star shining brightly in the sky, but always far away. His father was even colder. He believed his son would be a failure and didn't exactly go to much trouble to hide it. That left a deep mark on Winston. For the rest of his life, he felt an almost constant need to prove himself. He wanted applause, success, a place in history. It was as if he spent his whole life trying to collect from the entire world the approval he never received from his father. A slightly ambitious goal, obviously. His school years were not exactly a legendary beginning either. He attended Harrow, but struggled, especially with mathematics and the classical languages. He was far more interested in toy soldiers, history, and English than in most of his lessons. Instead of going to university, he decided to apply to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He failed the entrance exam on his first attempt, failed again on the second. He got in on the third. If he were giving a motivational speech today, this is probably where he would say, "Never give up." Churchill would likely add, "Just take the exam again. The questions might be easier this time." At Sandhurst, he did surprisingly well, mainly because, for once, he was studying something he actually liked. In 1895, he joined the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. That same year, his father died at the age of just 45. Churchill was 20. Their relationship had never healed, and now it never could. Young Winston seemed to have two options ahead of him: live a quiet life as an army officer, or stick his nose into practically every conflict taking place anywhere on Earth. As you can probably guess, he chose the second one. Churchill's officer's salary was not enough to support the lifestyle he was used to, so he came up with a plan: travel to war zones and send reports back to newspapers. He would have adventures, make money, and become famous, all at once. It had a slightly modern content creator feel to it, except the bullets flying in the background were real. His first stop was Cuba in 1895. He observed the war for independence against Spain and sent articles to British newspapers. It was there that he saw real combat for the first time. It is also said to be where he discovered cigars. So Churchill returned from Cuba with experience, plenty of material to write about, and an expensive habit that would last for the rest of his life. Next, he traveled to India with his regiment. He could have spent his days playing polo, but in his spare time he began reading obsessively: Plato, Darwin, history, political philosophy, pretty much anything he could get his hands on. The unmotivated schoolboy had disappeared, replaced by an ambitious young man designing his own education. So maybe the student isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's the curriculum. Sometimes. In 1897, he joined a British military campaign in the Malakand region, in what is now northwestern Pakistan. He was both an officer and a correspondent. He would fight in the morning, then write a newspaper report about it in the evening. Ethically, that arrangement was a little strange. As a work schedule, it was simply horrific. Those experiences became his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force. The book brought him not only money, but serious public recognition. Around the same time, he wrote a novel called Savrola. It would be the only novel he ever published. World literature probably did not regard that as a devastating loss, but, well, the man gave it a try. Churchill's years in India helped shape his character. Unfortunately, they also hardened his ideas about empire. He believed Britain had the right to rule other peoples. His dismissive views of colonized societies would grow more open and more disturbing with time. So he did not develop only his courage and his writing skills in his youth. He also carried away ideas that would later become one of the darkest parts of his legacy. In 1898, he went to Sudan and joined General Herbert Kitchener's army. At the Battle of Andaman, he took part in a cavalry charge, often described as one of the last major cavalry charges in British military history. Churchill used a pistol instead of a sword because an old injury to his shoulder made swinging a blade difficult. A practical solution, by his standards. At Andaman, the Anglo-Egyptian army, equipped with modern machine guns, crushed a much larger Sudanese force. Churchill was impressed by the victory, but disturbed by the treatment of wounded enemies and the brutality of the campaign. He openly criticized Kitchener. This was an important contradiction. Churchill believed in empire, yet he could object to certain examples of the violence that empire used. Sometimes it feels as if two different Churchills are standing inside the very same sentence. He wrote about his experiences in Sudan in the River War. He was still only in his early 20s and had already witnessed several wars, published books, and made a name for himself in the newspapers. A normal person might have taken a little time off at this point. Churchill went to South Africa. In 1899, the Second Boer War began between Britain and the Boer republics of South Africa. The Boers were communities largely descended from Dutch settlers. The region's gold and diamond deposits had made the political tension even worse. When empires are involved, peace rarely follows the sentence, "We just happened to discover some extremely valuable minerals here." This time, Churchill traveled to the region as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. While he was riding on an armored train, Boer forces ambushed it. Churchill helped clear derailed carriages and assisted the soldiers escape, but he was eventually captured. He argued that he was a journalist because he was not wearing a military uniform. The Boers pointed out that he had actively taken part in the fighting and treated him as a prisoner of war. He was taken to a prison camp in Pretoria. He did not stay for very long. One night, he climbed over a wall, hid, jumped onto freight trains, and after escaping across hundreds of miles, reached Portuguese-controlled Mozambique. Some details of the escape are still debated, but the result is not. Young Churchill became a hero talked about across Britain. In today's language, his personal brand absolutely exploded. He returned to South Africa, joined British forces, and was present when Pretoria was captured. He went home before the worst phase of Britain's concentration camps and scorched earth policy. That meant he did not directly witness the later brutality of the war, though the workings of the imperial system he served were already plain to see. Stories about Churchill's drinking habits also begin to gather around these years. It is said that he took dozens of bottles of wine, whiskey, and brandy with him when he went to the front. The list sounds less like a soldier's luggage and more like the opening inventory of a small bar. Still, it would be misleading to describe him as drunk at every hour of the day. He drank heavily, yes, but he spread much of it over long hours and maintained an intense work schedule for decades. Was it healthy? Almost certainly not. Was it as simple as the legends make it sound? No, not that either. By the time he returned to Britain in 1900, he was no longer merely the son of an aristocratic family. His books, war reporting, and escape story had made him famous. He was elected as the Member of Parliament for Oldham and entered Parliament at the age of 25. During his first years in politics, he belonged to the Conservative Party, but Churchill's loyalty was tied less to a party label than to his own ideas and, let's be honest, his own future. He supported free trade, clashed with the party leadership over military spending, and wanted a more conciliatory policy after the Boer War. In 1904, he physically crossed the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Liberal Party. This was not merely a change of principle, it was also a carefully calculated move that rescued his political career. For Churchill, conviction and ambition often traveled in the same car. Which one was driving depended on the day, well, sort of. When the Liberals won the 1906 election, Churchill rose quickly. As president of the Board of Trade, he worked with David Lloyd George on social reform. He supported measures limiting miners' working days to 8 hours, establishing labor exchanges to help people find jobs, and creating wage boards in low-paid industries. That may sound surprising. After all, he would later become famous as a committed conservative and one of socialism's fiercest enemies. But the young Churchill believed the state had to step in to reduce poverty. His idea was to introduce reform so there would be no revolution. In other words, he wanted to help workers, but also wanted to make sure the workers did not decide to replace the entire system. Compassion and political calculation riding in the same car again. In 1908, he married Clementine Hosier. Clementine was intelligent, direct, and entirely unafraid to disagree with Churchill. That last quality was especially important because there were not many people around him willing to say, "No, Winston, that is genuinely a terrible idea." Their marriage was long and loving, but it was not easy. Churchill's political ambition, financial problems, long journeys, and shifting moods placed strain on the family. They had 5 children: Diana, Randolph, Sarah, Marigold, and Mary. The death of Marigold before her 3rd birthday devastated both Winston and Clementine. Beneath the hard shell, Churchill showed the public was a man carrying profound loss. You cannot see that part in most of the photographs. In 1910, he became Home Secretary. The police, prisons, and domestic security of the country were now his responsibility. Labor strikes were growing, as was the suffragette movement demanding votes for women. Churchill was never a consistently progressive voice on women's suffrage. He opposed it at first, later softened his position under certain conditions, but never became a dependable ally of the movement. The question of sending troops during the Tonypandy miners' strike in Wales followed him for years. In reality, he did not simply unleash soldiers on the strikers, he sent police first and kept the troops in reserve. But the workers remembered him as the face of state force. In politics, what people see can matter just as much as what you actually do. His decision to personally appear at the siege of Sydney Street in London in 1911, however, was pure Churchill. Armed criminals were surrounded inside a house. Did the Home Secretary need to stand at the scene in his hat, watching the gunfight and the building burn? No. Did it make for a striking photograph? Absolutely. If it happened today, his communications team would probably love it. That same year, he was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, not the First Sea Lord, but effectively the political head of the Royal Navy. Churchill was now responsible for the Navy at the cabinet level. Europe was moving rapidly toward war, and this position would prepare the ground for both one of the greatest achievements of his career and its biggest disaster. Churchill accelerated the modernization of the Navy. He supported converting warships from coal to oil, invested in new battleships, and prepared for the growing naval rivalry with Germany. When the First World War began in 1914, the Royal Navy was not completely unprepared. Churchill deserved a great deal of credit for that. But by 1915, the Western Front had become deadlocked. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were dying in the trenches of France for tiny pieces of land. Churchill was searching for a bold plan that might change the balance of the war. He turned his attention toward the Ottoman Empire. The rough idea went like this: the Navy would force its way through the Dardanelles, reach Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a secure supply route to Russia. It looked impressive on paper. Drawing arrows across a map is always easy. Things become slightly more complicated when those arrows pass through minefields, coastal artillery, and thousands of defenders. The naval operation came first. On March 18, 1915, the Allied fleet suffered severe losses as mines sank or disabled several battleships. Landings were then planned. British, French, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and other troops came ashore on the Gallipoli Peninsula, but the Ottoman defense, especially the units commanded by Mustafa Kemal, stopped them from breaking through. Narrow beaches, steep ground, disease, lack of water, and poor planning turned the campaign into hell. Both sides suffered enormous casualties during months of fighting. The Allied forces were finally evacuated in late 1915 and early 1916. Gallipoli was more than a military defeat. It left a deep mark on the national memory of Australia and New Zealand, on the story modern Turkey tells about its own history, and on Churchill's career. So was it all Churchill's fault? No, the cabinet had approved the plan, and both the military and naval commanders made serious mistakes. The goals of the operation kept changing, while coordination between the Navy and the Army was badly handled. But Churchill had been the plan's most enthusiastic advocate, and in the public mind he became the face of the disaster. Shared victories are divided up very quickly in politics. Shared defeats usually get dropped on one person's desk. This one landed on Churchill's. He was forced out of his position. His career appeared to be over. Most politicians in that situation would have written their memoirs and waited quietly. Churchill went to the Western Front and commanded an infantry battalion. He spent months in the trenches. An artillery shell landed nearby, and he narrowly escaped death. The experience gave him a much closer view of life as an ordinary soldier on the front line. In 1917, he returned to government as Minister of Munitions. He managed factory production, labor problems, and the constant supply of weapons to the army. It was not a glamorous role, but it was essential to winning the war. Great speeches are not much use when you run out of ammunition. After all, by the time the war ended in 1918, Churchill had returned to the center of politics once again. But Europe had not found peace. Empires had collapsed, revolutions had begun, and the Bolsheviks had taken power in Russia. Churchill had already chosen his next enemy. Churchill saw Bolshevism as a major threat to Europe. While serving as Secretary of State for War and Air, he argued that Britain should support anti-Bolshevik forces in the Russian Civil War. At a time when the country was exhausted by war and soldiers wanted to come home, he kept calling for deeper intervention in Russia. Most of the cabinet did not share his enthusiasm. These years revealed Churchill's darker side very clearly. In a memorandum discussing the possible use of gas to suppress uprisings in Iraq, he used degrading language such as uncivilized tribes. The question of what he meant by gas has been debated for years. Some historians stress that he was referring to tear gas rather than lethal chemical weapons. That distinction may matter, but his language and his willingness to treat experiments on colonized peoples as normal remain indefensible. There is no point polishing the sentence until it looks clean. He was contradictory on Ireland as well. Earlier in his life, he had opposed partition and supported Home Rule, but during the Irish War of Independence, he was part of the government while the violence of the Black and Tans and the Auxiliary Division destroyed Britain's reputation. On the other hand, he played an important part in negotiating and shaping the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. So he belonged to the state system that helped make the conflict more brutal, while also helping build the agreement that ended it. History does not always let us place a person neatly into one box. In 1921, he became colonial secretary. After the war, Britain and France were redrawing the map of the Middle East. At the Cairo conference, the future of Iraq and Transjordan was discussed. Borders, dynasties, and systems of government were often shaped more by imperial calculations than by the wishes of the people who lived there. Churchill was not merely watching this new order take shape, he was one of its architects. In Palestine, he supported the idea of a Jewish national home while also promising that the rights of the Arab population would be protected. How exactly both goals could be achieved at the same time was never clear. The following decades would demonstrate, rather forcefully, that this was not a minor detail. The government fell in 1922, and Churchill lost his seat in Parliament. He tried to return in several elections and failed again. Meanwhile, the Liberal Party was weakening and the Labour Party was growing. Churchill's fear of socialism began drawing him back toward his old party, the Conservatives. In 1924, he formally rejoined the Conservative Party. A famous line is often attributed to him: "Anyone can rat, but it takes a certain ingenuity to re-rat." Whether he actually said it, and in precisely what form, is disputed, but it certainly sounds like him. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made him Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yes, Churchill, a man with no formal training in economics, was suddenly put in charge of Britain's economy. Politics never runs out of surprises. In 1925, he returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value. The decision was meant to strengthen international confidence in the currency, but it made sterling overvalued. Exports became more difficult, industry came under pressure, and unemployment increased. The economist John Maynard Keynes attacked the decision fiercely. Churchill himself would later admit that it had been one of his greatest mistakes. During the general strike of 1926, he took a hard line against the trade unions. He interfered in the running of the government newspaper and treated the strikers as a force challenging the authority of the state. The man who had once promoted reforms for workers was now one of organized labor's most powerful enemies. Yes, still the same man. The Conservatives lost the election in 1929, and Churchill was left out of government. For much of the 1930s, the party leadership kept him on the sidelines as well. This period became known as his wilderness years. But Churchill had never learned how to stay quiet. I don't think they installed that feature at the factory. During the 1930s, Churchill wrote, painted, worked in the garden, and even built walls at his home, Chartwell. And yes, he really laid the bricks himself. A former Chancellor of the Exchequer spending his afternoon building a garden wall sounds a little odd, but by Churchill's standards it counted as a peaceful hobby. He earned a large part of his income through books and journalism. He completed The World Crisis, his multi-volume account of the First World War. Then he wrote an enormous 4-volume biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. His books were not impartial. Churchill often wrote history in a way that doubled as a defense of Churchill, but his prose was powerful, and he knew how to turn events into drama. It was as if the man did not merely write history, he staged it. He is said to have called the dark moods he sometimes experienced during this period his black dog. Whether this was clinical depression remains disputed. What is certain is that political isolation, financial pressure, and a sense of failure weighed on him. Even so, he kept working. But on the question of India, his position grew harsher and increasingly backward, even by the standards of his own time. He opposed granting India broad self-government. He belittled Mahatma Gandhi and used openly racist language. Churchill believed that Britain's withdrawal would lead to the collapse of order, and that Indians were not ready to govern themselves. Churchill's defenders argue that he foresaw the partition and massacres that followed independence. And yes, he recognized that Hindu-Muslim tension posed a serious danger, but that did not justify denying millions of people the right to determine their own future. Seeing the possibility of disaster is not the same thing as having the right to defend colonial rule forever. His angry speeches about India also damaged his credibility in Parliament. A few years later, that would matter enormously, because on another subject, Churchill was right, and this time, terrifyingly so. Germany. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. The Nazis quickly crushed the opposition, turned the country into a one-party dictatorship, and began rearming in open violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Churchill was one of the few well-known British politicians to sound the alarm early. Again and again, he raised Germany's growing air power, expanding army, and Hitler's aggressive language in Parliament. He called for the Royal Air Force to be strengthened, with private information supplied by contacts inside the government and intelligence services. He kept track of the true scale of German rearmament. So why didn't everyone listen to him? Because the wound of the First World War was still wide open. Millions of families were terrified of another war. Britain was struggling economically and wasn't militarily ready. Some people believed Germany had been treated too harshly at Versailles. Others considered the Soviet Union a greater threat than the Nazis. And then there were Churchill's extreme outbursts over India and various other issues. People looked at him and thought, oh, is he predicting disaster again? In short, Churchill was sounding the right alarm, but the man ringing it had already sent the whole kitchen into a panic one too many times. In 1936, King Edward VIII's wish to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, turned into a major constitutional crisis. Churchill supported Edward and, once again, found himself on the wrong side of public opinion. The king eventually gave up the throne, and his brother became George VI. The crisis damaged Churchill's reputation and also pushed events in Germany into the background for a while. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister in 1937. His main goal was to prevent another European war. Today, appeasement is often described as simple cowardice. In reality, Britain needed time to rearm and the public wasn't ready for war. Even so, the policy fed Hitler's appetite instead of satisfying it. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Then Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the heavily German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain traveled to Munich to meet him. The Munich Agreement, signed in September 1938, handed the Sudetenland to Germany while Czechoslovakia was barely given a proper seat at the table. In return, Hitler promised he would make no more territorial demands. When Chamberlain returned to London, he believed he had brought peace. Churchill called the agreement a total and unmitigated defeat. In his view, every concession given to Hitler was simply preparation for the next demand. In March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia too. Hitler's promise had lasted roughly 6 months. It was now obvious that Poland was next. Britain and France guaranteed Polish independence, rearmament accelerated, and Churchill, the man they had kept on the sidelines for years, was suddenly being taken seriously again. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. That same day, Chamberlain brought Churchill back as First Lord of the Admiralty. A message went out to the ships of the Royal Navy: "Winston is back." That sentence reassured some people and probably worried a few others. Gallipoli was still in living memory, after all. During the first months of the war, the Western Front remained relatively quiet. This period became known as the Phony War. Poland had been invaded, but Britain and France had not launched a major ground offensive against Germany. Churchill focused on Norway's strategic importance. Germany needed Swedish iron ore and Norwegian ports, while Britain wanted to cut German supply routes. But in April 1940, German forces rapidly occupied Denmark and Norway. The British and Allied response was badly planned and ended in failure. The defeat in Norway triggered a huge debate in Parliament. Prime Minister Chamberlain lost the support of his own party. Churchill also carried responsibility for planning the campaign. He admitted it and defended Chamberlain during the debate. Strangely enough, his willingness to accept responsibility actually improved his reputation. Chamberlain resigned on May 10, 1940. There were 2 serious candidates to replace him: Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill. Halifax sat in the House of Lords, didn't want the job at that point in the war, and would have struggled to form a coalition that included the Labour Party. King George VI asked Churchill to form a government. On the very day Churchill became Prime Minister, Germany attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. A slightly busy first day at work. 3 days later, he told Parliament that all he had to offer was blood, toil, tears and sweat. The words sound grand today, but at that moment the situation was genuinely horrifying. The German army was advancing through France far faster than expected. Allied armies were being surrounded, governments were collapsing, and Britain's chances of losing the war seemed to grow by the hour. At the end of May, a critical argument erupted inside the British War Cabinet. Foreign Secretary Halifax wanted to explore possible peace terms with Germany through Mussolini. That would not necessarily have meant immediate surrender, but it would have opened the door to negotiations. Churchill believed that any agreement made while Hitler controlled most of Europe would leave Britain independent in name only. The debate lasted several days. In the end, the cabinet decided to keep fighting. Churchill's most important contribution to history may not have been a battle plan at all. It may simply have been his ability to say no at that exact moment. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Using Royal Navy ships, merchant vessels, and a great many small civilian boats, more than 338,000 troops were evacuated. It was an extraordinary rescue, but it was still a rescue from military defeat. Most of the heavy weapons had been abandoned in France, and France itself surrendered only weeks later. Churchill told the public this plainly: wars were not won by evacuations. Then he declared that Britain would fight on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets, and that it would never surrender. The power of that speech wasn't only in the words. It made people feel that even in defeat, they still had a choice. At the same time, Churchill made decisions that were brutal and deeply controversial. After France surrendered, he feared its powerful navy might fall into German hands. In July 1940, the French fleet at Mers el-Kheba in Algeria was given an ultimatum. When no agreement could be reached, British ships opened fire on their former allies, killing around 1,300 French sailors. The attack caused fury in France. To Churchill, it was a terrible but deliberate signal to the world, especially to America, that Britain would not surrender. Was it the right decision? People still argue about that. It wasn't an easy decision. It certainly wasn't a clean one. In the summer of 1940, Germany tried to force Britain to surrender through air attacks. The Battle of Britain, fought between the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe, lasted for months. Britain's air defenses, radar network, pilots, and ground crews prevented Germany from gaining air superiority. Then came the Blitz, targeting London and other cities. The Blitz was the name of a bombing campaign. Saying it was simply short for the Blitzkrieg isn't quite accurate. Anyway, enough with the word debate. Bombs were falling. Churchill visited bombed neighborhoods and spoke with people among the ruins. On some visits he was cheered. In other places, he was met with anger. Not everyone believed the government was doing enough to protect them. Still, Churchill presented the image of a leader who didn't hide the danger from the public and who came to see their suffering with his own eyes. He spent hours preparing his speeches. They sounded as though the sentences had simply flowed out of him, but most of the words were chosen with great care. He even marked his pauses and rehearsed the delivery, so that famous natural style was actually the result of a whole lot of preparation. Handcrafted spontaneity sounds familiar. Britain was still fighting, but its money and supplies were running out. Churchill built a close relationship with US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Much of the American public wanted to stay out of the war. Roosevelt couldn't send troops directly, but in March 1941 he launched the Lend-Lease program. Britain received ships, aircraft, food, fuel, and weapons. The aid was vital, but in return, Britain had to give up military bases, make economic concessions, and surrender part of its global power. While Churchill was trying to save the empire, he was also opening the door to a new world order in which leadership would pass to the United States. History's irony isn't always subtle. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Churchill had opposed communism throughout his life, yet he immediately announced support for the Soviets, because at that moment, the main objective was defeating Hitler. The regime he had called his greatest enemy yesterday was now an ally. Churchill didn't describe this as an ideological conversion, he had merely rearranged his priorities. Political flexibility, let's call it. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. Churchill later wrote in his memoirs that, when he heard the news, he truly believed for the first time that the war would ultimately be won. He understood that his relief came in the wake of a horrific attack, but Britain was no longer alone. America's industrial power and the Soviet Union's manpower were now part of the same war. Victory was still nowhere near, though. In fact, 1942 began as a complete nightmare for the British Empire. Japanese forces advanced rapidly down Malaya and reached Singapore. British defenses had assumed the attack would come from the sea, so the landward side had not been properly prepared. Japanese troops crossed terrain that had been called impassable. Singapore surrendered on February 15, 1942, and around 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops were taken prisoner. Churchill called it one of the worst disasters in British military history. He was right. The empire's image of invincibility collapsed in a matter of weeks. When Japan seized Burma as well, India's eastern frontier came under threat. The flow of rice from Burma was cut off. At the same time, demands for Indian independence were growing stronger. Gandhi's Quit India movement called on Britain to leave the country. Churchill opposed it fiercely, while Roosevelt's administration pressured London to reach an agreement with Indian leaders. In 1943, Bengal suffered a devastating famine. An estimated 3 million people died. There is no joke in this section, nor should there be. The famine had no single cause. Japan's occupation of Burma cut off rice imports. A cyclone and crop disease in 1942 damaged agriculture. Wartime spending drove up prices, food distribution broke down, and hoarding increased. The boat denial policy, along with other attempts to keep resources away from a possible Japanese invasion, crippled local transport. Bad decisions by the colonial government, poor coordination between provinces, and a shortage of shipping all made the crisis worse. Historians still debate the degree of Churchill's personal responsibility. It would be wrong to portray him as a man who single-handedly planned the famine, but his government's wartime shipping priorities, its slow response to requests for aid, and its contemptuous attitude toward India all played a part in deepening the catastrophe. Some of Churchill's racist remarks about Indians also raise entirely fair questions about his attitude toward relief. More grain arrived from overseas in late 1943 and 1944, the harvest improved, and the famine eased. But for millions of people, it was too late. It would be dishonest to tell the story of Churchill's leadership in 1940 and reduce Bengal to a footnote. A person's greatest achievement does not erase their heaviest responsibilities. On other fronts, however, the balance of the war had started to shift. In November 1942, British forces defeated the German and Italian armies at El Alamein. After the victory, Churchill said it was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. A bit winding, that sentence. Still a good one. Words were his thing. In 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The Allies landed in Sicily and then Italy. Churchill saw an advance through the Mediterranean as an attack on Europe's soft underbelly. Italy did not turn out to be an easy target. Fighting through its mountainous terrain was slow and bloody. Some American commanders believed Churchill's obsession with the Balkans and the Mediterranean had delayed the invasion of France. Churchill's big ideas were back on the table, and by now, we know his big ideas didn't always end well. Churchill's working routine was anything but normal. He woke early, but he didn't immediately get out of bed. He read the newspapers, dictated letters and notes to his secretaries, and received visitors. Sometimes meetings were held right there beside the bed. Then came a long lunch, a short nap, dinner, and another stretch of work that continued well past midnight. He said the afternoon nap gave him 2 working days instead of 1. Not entirely unreasonable. Still, if you're a member of the war cabinet and the Prime Minister walks into a meeting wearing a dressing gown, you do sort of pause and think. Alcohol was part of the routine too, although not every legend surrounding his drinking should be trusted. He often drank whiskey heavily diluted with water, preferred wine or champagne with meals, and worked late into the night. What is certain is that neither his constitution nor his work schedule was ordinary. Do I really need to add "don't try this at home"? I don't know, but don't. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Churchill attended numerous conferences with Roosevelt and Stalin in Casablanca, Tehran, Quebec, Moscow, and later Yalta. They discussed not only how to win the war, but how the world would be divided once it was over. Roosevelt was focused on defeating Japan and establishing the United Nations. Stalin wanted governments friendly to Moscow across Eastern Europe as a buffer for Soviet security. Churchill was especially afraid that Poland, Greece, and the Balkans would fall completely under Soviet influence. But Britain's power was fading. There were 3 great leaders at the table, yet Churchill's country was now the weakest of the 3. In 1944, preparations accelerated for the Great Invasion of France. Churchill had serious concerns about the D-Day plan. The ghost of Gallipoli still followed him. He feared that if the landing beaches had been chosen badly, or if the plan leaked to the Germans, thousands of soldiers would die on the shore. He didn't block the operation, but he questioned every detail. He even wanted to go with the invasion fleet. When King George VI said that in that case he ought to come too, Churchill finally backed down. Putting the Prime Minister and the King on the same ship during the most dangerous day of the war carried a slight risk for the machinery of state. Just a tiny one. The Normandy landings began on June 6, 1944. The losses were heavy, but the Allies managed to hold their ground on the coast. Britain's refusal to leave the war in 1940 was now producing its real result. the island had become a vast military base for the liberation of Western Europe. As the Soviet army advanced from the east and the Western Allies pushed in through France, Nazi Germany was squeezed from both sides. But even with victory getting closer, the final months of the war brought horrifying decisions. Churchill had long supported the large-scale bombing of German cities. The aim was to break industrial production, transport networks, and the public's will to continue the war. The attacks destroyed many factories and railways. They also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and reduced cities to ruins. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 became one of the most controversial examples of that policy. British and American air raids burned much of the city and killed around 25,000 people. Dresden had military and transport significance, but the scale of the attack and the fact that the war was so close to ending drew fierce criticism. Churchill later wrote a memorandum warning that the bombing should not look like mere terror and destruction. Some of his supporters have viewed this as an attempt to shift responsibility for the policy onto others. Either way, he had been one of the political leaders behind area bombing and cannot be separated entirely from its consequences. On April 30, 1945, Hitler killed himself in Berlin. Germany surrendered on May 8. The streets of London filled with people. Churchill stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace beside the king and the royal family, waving to the crowd. The man who had been considered political wreckage only a few years earlier was now the face of victory. Then came the election. During the war, Churchill had led a coalition government with Labour and the Liberals. As soon as the war in Europe ended, he called for an election. Voting took place on July 5, 1945, but because ballots from servicemen overseas had to be counted, the result wasn't announced until July 26. Churchill expected a great victory. The public loved him as a wartime leader, but in peacetime, British voters wanted different things: housing, jobs, social security, education, and healthcare. William Beveridge's plan for a welfare state had enormous public support. Clement Attlee's Labour Party promised to put it into practice. During the campaign, Churchill said Labour would need some form of Gestapo to carry out certain policies. After 6 years of fighting the Nazis, the comparison didn't go over especially well. To put it gently, it wasn't the campaign team's brightest day. Labour won by a landslide. Churchill left office. The man who had led Britain to victory in the war was voted out before the victory celebrations were even finished. That wasn't really ingratitude on the voters' part. People had trusted Churchill to fight the war. They chose Attlee to build the peace. History sometimes tells a leader, "You were brilliant in that chapter, but we're changing the cast for the new season." Once in opposition, Churchill began warning about the Soviet Union. Soviet-backed regimes were taking shape across Eastern Europe, and Poland and Hungary were falling under Moscow's influence. Churchill had worked with Stalin during the war, but he saw that cooperation as an alliance of necessity. In March 1946, speaking at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. He wasn't the first person to use the phrase, but he turned it into one of the defining symbols of the Cold War. He argued that Britain and the United States should work closely together and stand united against Soviet expansion. That same year in Zurich, he spoke of a United States of Europe. He saw reconciliation between France and Germany as the foundation of European peace. But it was never entirely clear whether he wanted Britain fully inside such a structure, or supporting it while standing slightly off to the side. Churchill loved big ideas. The details could sometimes wait until the next meeting. India gained independence in 1947 and was partitioned into India and Pakistan. The partition brought mass killings and enormous population movements. The communal violence Churchill had warned about for years really did occur. But as we said earlier, that doesn't automatically prove his wish to preserve colonial rule was right. Britain's hurried withdrawal, and the divide and rule policies it had practiced for decades, also helped create the conditions for disaster. The Conservatives returned to power in the 1951 election. Churchill became Prime Minister again as he approached the age of 77. His second term was nowhere near as dramatic as his first. He focused on foreign policy and the danger of nuclear war. At home, house building accelerated and wartime rationing finally came to an end. But his health was failing. In 1953, he suffered a serious stroke. The government largely hid the news from the public. Churchill spent months recovering and refused to leave office. Holding on to power was an old habit of his. Letting go, not so much. That same year, Queen Elizabeth II appointed him a Knight Companion of the Garter, making him Sir Winston Churchill. Also in 1953, he received the Nobel Prize in Literature. The prize recognized his historical and biographical writing as well as his gift for oratory. The award still surprises some people. Churchill wasn't simply a politician who gave speeches. He wrote millions of words and published multi-volume histories, memoirs, biographies, and articles. Of course, he relied on researchers and supporting writers. His later books in particular were the work of large teams. But the narrative voice and the political purpose of the texts were unmistakably Churchill's. He finally resigned as Prime Minister in 1955. Anthony Eden replaced him. Churchill remained a member of Parliament, but gradually withdrew from active politics. At Chartwell, he painted, wrote, and travelled. He watched the British Empire dissolve with profound sadness. He had spent his life believing it was permanent. Now it was disappearing before his eyes. Churchill's health deteriorated further during the 1960s. In 1962, he fell in Monte Carlo and broke his hip. In 1963, the United States granted him honorary citizenship. At the ceremony, President John F. Kennedy praised Churchill as one of the defenders of human freedom. Churchill was too unwell to attend. His son Randolph represented him. He left Parliament in 1964. In total, he had served as an MP for more than 60 years. He had entered politics in an age when horse-drawn carriages still filled the streets and left it in an age when nuclear weapons could destroy the world. On January 10, 1965, he suffered a severe stroke. 2 weeks later, on January 24, he died at the age of 90. In one of history's strange coincidences, his father had died exactly 70 years earlier. Also on January 24, Churchill was given a state funeral. His body lay in state at Westminster Hall before a grand service at St. Paul's Cathedral. It was highly unusual for Queen Elizabeth II to attend a politician's funeral. World leaders came to London. As his coffin travelled along the River Thames, the dockside cranes lowered their jibs in salute. He was then taken to Oxfordshire and buried beside his family in the village of Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace where he had been born. His life had unfolded in great palaces, war rooms, and global conferences. His grave was in the churchyard of a small village, a rather quiet ending. Finally, judging Winston Churchill isn't easy, because there are two grand stories told about him, and neither is complete on its own. In the first story, Churchill is the great hero who refused to submit to Hitler in 1940, kept Britain's morale alive, and left the road to Europe's liberation open. There is a powerful truth in that story. If Britain had left the war, a Western Allied return to France would have been far harder, perhaps impossible. Churchill's speeches didn't stop tanks on their own, but they helped prevent political will from collapsing. Sometimes whether a country keeps fighting depends on decisions made in a handful of rooms. In 1940, Churchill was in one of those rooms, and he said, "Carry on." In the second story, Churchill is a ruler who opposed the freedom of colonial peoples in order to preserve the British Empire, used racist language, played a role in disasters such as Gallipoli, supported area bombing, and responded to the Bengal famine with inadequacy and indifference. There is a powerful truth in this story too. Reducing him to a cigar, a victory sign, and a collection of courageous speeches would mean ignoring the suffering experienced by millions of people. So which one is true? Both. Churchill was not a saint, nor was he a cartoon villain. He carried some of the prejudices of his era, and on certain issues he made mistakes that went beyond even the standards of that era. At the same time, when many politicians were considering retreat, he saw the danger clearly and stood by his decision. What makes him interesting isn't that he was flawless. Quite the opposite, his flaws were as enormous as his achievements. Maybe the real question we should ask about Churchill isn't, was he a good man or a bad man? Ask it that way and history turns into a children's book. The more uncomfortable question might be this: how can one person become one of freedom's strongest defenders in one moment, yet so easily ignore the freedom of other people in another? And perhaps that is exactly what Churchill's life reminds us. The people who change history are not always clean, consistent, or easy to love. Sometimes the person who makes the right decision at the right moment is the very same person who makes terribly wrong decisions at other times.